They did a seismic survey around the Sphinx, and they identified a very large geometrical chamber, about 15 feet beneath the forepaws of the Sphinx.
The Great Sphinx has survived sand, storms, and centuries of mystery. But archaeologists just uncovered something that changes everything. Fresh scans just revealed a hidden chamber sealed deep inside the stone, untouched for thousands of years.
When could the Sphinx have been exposed to what turns out, what needs to have been, about 1,000 years of very heavy rainfall?
To make sense of it, you have to look at how old the Sphinx really is and everything it has survived.
Ukrainian geologists believe that the Sphinx could be as much as 800,000 years old.
Joe Rogan has warned that mainstream history may be hiding whole chapters of its story. And now, this chamber could be the discovery that makes Joe Rogan's words impossible to ignore. The hidden chamber.
The Great Sphinx of Giza.
The shape of it is the head of a king and the body of a lion.
Archaeologists were out on the Giza Plateau, setting up their instruments right around the paws of the Great Sphinx. This monument has been poked, prodded, and studied for more than 200 years. But here they were again. They had seismic sensors. They had ground-penetrating radar, the kind of stuff that can look through the ground without digging a single shovel of dirt. The scans were supposed to be routine, nothing groundbreaking. But then, one of the machines lit up. The radar bounced back an echo that didn't belong. It showed a hollow space where there should have been solid limestone. They reset the gear, ran the tests again, and got the exact same reading. That's when it clicked. They weren't looking at solid rock at all. They were staring at the outline of a chamber sealed beneath one of the most mysterious monuments in the world.
Its body is about 250 feet long, which is nearly a football field long.
Now, this wasn't like a movie scene where a wall falls away and piles of treasure spill out. It was quiet, almost unsettling. When they mapped it out, the space looked sealed for thousands of years. Dust covered the floor, thick enough to make it feel like no one had been inside for thousands of years. The walls showed tool marks from human hands, but time had softened them. Here and there, faint traces of paint still clung to the stone, suggesting it might once have been decorated. Nothing inside screamed out an explanation, but it didn't fit neatly into the story most people thought they already knew. And that's where the real question begins. To truly understand why such a space exists under the Sphinx at all, you have to first deal with the debate that has split researchers for decades. How old is the Sphinx, and what kind of weather, repair, and history has it truly survived? If you ask most Egyptologists, the answer is simple. They will tell you the Sphinx was carved during the 4th dynasty under Pharaoh Khafra, sometime between 2520 and 2494 BCE. That's not just a guess. The evidence ties the Sphinx directly to Khafra's complex. The Valley Temple, sitting right next to it, is made of blocks cut from the Sphinx's own trench. A statue of Khafra himself was found inside that temple. All of this makes the site read like one single coordinated project of the Old Kingdom, not a bunch of pieces from different eras. But in the early 1990s, a very different idea started getting attention. A writer named John Anthony West, drawing on the earlier work of R.A. Schwaller de Lubitsch, claimed that the erosion patterns on the Sphinx didn't look like they were caused only by desert winds and sand.
Tell the difference between weathering by water and weathering by wind and sand. The answer was cautiously expressed as a general rule, yes.
To him, they looked like the result of heavy, sustained rainfall. And if rain had done the damage, that would mean the Sphinx had to be far older than the Old Kingdom, because the Sahara hasn't seen that kind of climate for thousands of years. This became known as the water erosion hypothesis. West brought in a geologist, Robert Schoch, from Boston University to check the claim. Schoch wasn't a believer when he arrived in 1990. In fact, he expected to find that the weathering was just sand and wind. But when he took a closer look at the Sphinx's enclosure, he saw the same thing West had noticed. The walls showed rounded surfaces and deep vertical fissures that looked to him like they had been shaped by water running down them for long periods of time.
This is clear evidence to me as a geologist. Erosional feature we see was caused by rain beating down on the rocks.
That first impression was enough to make him dig deeper. Schoch teamed up with geophysicist Thomas Debicki to carry out seismic surveys beneath the enclosure floor. The results added fuel to the fire. They found that the stone on the north, east, and south sides had been weathered to a depth of about 1.8 to 2.5 meters, while the west side had only about 1.2 meters of weathered rock. To Schoch, this meant the front and sides had been exposed to the elements far longer than the back. He argued that the west side might have been cut later, during known ancient repair programs, while the rest of the enclosure was already old and weathered.
I think there's good reason to believe that the back was carved out or cut out in Khafra's time, in Chevron's time.
If that interpretation is correct, then the Sphinx could date all the way back to the late Pleistocene or the very start of the Holocene, which is essentially the end of the last ice age. North Africa at that time had a much wetter climate, with regular heavy rains. For reference, the Holocene begins about 11,700 years before the year 2000, which means around 9,700 BCE. That kind of climate would make sense of the rain erosion hypothesis, but the Sphinx hasn't simply stood still for thousands of years. The surface tells a layered story of repairs, some ancient, some modern. During the large clearance project of the 1920s and 30s, led by Émile Barrès, archaeologists documented masonry skins from different eras. There were repairs from the New Kingdom, more from the Sate period, and still more from Greco-Roman times, before Barrès himself added his own modern cement patches. This patchwork helps explain why parts of the Sphinx look relatively crisp, while others look heavily damaged. What you see today is a mix of original bedrock and repair layers stacked on top of each other. The monument also spent long stretches buried in sand. The famous Dream Stele, set between the paws of the Sphinx by Thutmose IV around 1401 BCE, tells how he fell asleep in its shade while it was covered in sand. In his dream, the Sphinx promised him kingship if he cleared it away. He did, and he later became pharaoh. But the sand came back.
And so with it, the sands of time come back. They start to bury the Sphinx again until it's buried all the way up into its neck.
Over the centuries, the Sphinx was buried and re-exposed again and again. Even in the modern era, Barrès' team in the 1930s had to dig the whole enclosure out. Being buried in sand didn't keep the monument safe either. Sand can hold moisture against limestone and create even more damage. Storms and shifts in humidity added to the wear and tear. So why does the Sphinx look the way it does? That's where the real battle of ideas begins. Schoch and West point to the rounded profiles and deep grooves and say, that's rain damage. Critics counter that the same shapes can be created by salt crystal exfoliation. In that process, salts inside the stone migrate outward, crystallize, and pop off thin layers of rock. This is not speculation. It is a documented problem in Egyptian limestone, proven by both lab tests and field studies. In the 1990s, researcher Kay Lalgori and colleagues published work showing how this salt process alone could explain the weathering within just the 4,500 years since Khafra.
And there's a lot of mystery surrounding when was the Sphinx actually sculpted.
Modern conservation notes still list salt action as one of the biggest threats to the Sphinx's survival. And there's another point. The Sphinx isn't carved from one uniform chunk of rock. It's made of layered limestone, and those layers vary. Some are hard and resist erosion. Others are soft and crumble quickly. That's why different parts of the monument look so different. And when you compare the Sphinx to nearby tombs or temples, you're not always comparing the same material. Many of those structures used stronger quarried blocks, often taken from layers with protective crusts. The Sphinx, exposed as it is, naturally weathers faster. Add to that the many repairs over the centuries, and the uneven look of the monument makes sense without requiring extreme ages. Still, not everyone who supports an older Sphinx agrees on the details. Two Ukrainian researchers, Vyacheslav Manichev and Alexander Parkhomenko, claimed the big horizontal hollows on the enclosure walls resemble wave-cut notches left by standing bodies of water. They tied this to high water levels in the early Pleistocene and suggested an age on the order of 800,000 years. That would mean the rock face itself was shaped by water long before dynastic Egypt. This claim goes far beyond Schoch's Ice Age idea and hasn't been accepted by mainstream science, but it still gets brought up whenever people want to push the Sphinx's timeline into extreme antiquity. Another voice, author Andrew Collins, offered a middle ground. He agreed the rock face could have been affected by ancient water, but he argued the actual carving of the Sphinx we recognize, the human-headed lion, might have been done later.
Details of how the pharaoh Khufu repaired the Sphinx after it was struck by lightning.
In his view, the stone canvas could be ancient, but the painting could still be much younger, carved in dynastic times. Let's circle back to the seismic studies. Schoch and Dobecki reported that the west side had only about 1.2 meters of weathered rock, while the other sides had up to 2.5 meters. To Schoch, that pattern made sense if the west side was cut back during a known ancient restoration, while the rest had already been exposed for thousands of years. Critics counter that differences in water drainage, salt action, and the varying limestone layers could also explain the pattern. The measurements themselves are not disputed. The argument is entirely about what those numbers mean. One claim often repeated is that if the Sphinx really was carved in Khafra's time, it could not possibly have eroded this much, especially after spending so many centuries buried in sand. But again, if salt and moisture are the main culprits, then the damage could accumulate very quickly. Once the harder surface layers are broken, the softer limestone underneath deteriorates fast. That doesn't prove the mainstream Old Kingdom date, but it agrees that the current damage is actually possible in that time frame. And remember, there is positive evidence that ties the Sphinx firmly to the 4th dynasty.
Thousands of years. The Sphinx was buried up to its neck in sand.
The entire Giza complex looks like a unified construction project. The quarry cuts, the matching stone, and the valley temple with Khafra's statue all point back to him. Radiocarbon dating of organic material from Old Kingdom mortar across the plateau, done in the 1980s and 90s, also pointed to the 3rd millennium BCE. Those tests weren't on the Sphinx itself, and radiocarbon can have issues with old wood, but the results still support the mainstream view. The long record of repairs makes a huge difference when thinking about new finds, like the chamber under the Sphinx. We know New Kingdom pharaohs weren't just clearing sand, they were repairing the monument.
Preserving of the centuries-old Sphinx from the ever-engulfing sands of the desert is an endless job.
The dream stele is propaganda, sure, but it also records organized work. Later, the Saite period and the Greco-Roman era added more masonry. Modern engineers used cement and replaced blocks, sometimes in ways that didn't last. That means any chamber or void uncovered today could belong to any of those phases. Without careful study, no one can just assume it's original. Which brings us right back to the heart of the argument. If the rounded profiles and grooves are really rain erosion, then they point to a time when North Africa was wet, around the late Pleistocene and early Holocene. If instead they are caused mainly by salts and humidity cycles working on uneven limestone layers, then the Sphinx fits comfortably into Khafra's 4th dynasty. Either way, the statue is extraordinary, and the debate shows how a single block of bedrock can carry stories of climate, geology, engineering, and politics all at once. And here's something worth clearing up. Early Egyptologists sometimes guessed the Sphinx might be older than the pyramids just because of its style. But those guesses have been replaced with solid evidence like quarry links and Khafra's statue. On the flip side, fringe theories that stretch the Sphinx's age to hundreds of thousands of years,
The body of the Sphinx, and therefore the original statue, had to go back to pre-Sahara times.
struggle with the simple fact that carving can be younger than the rock it's cut from. Yes, the rock is ancient, but the carving does not have to be. So how do you read a chamber under a monument like this? Think of it as pulling a loose thread. That thread could lead back to the original Old Kingdom build, or it could reveal a repair from the New Kingdom, or even a modern intervention. The only way to know is to document everything: tool marks, plaster, salts, masonry, and line it up with what we already know about the Sphinx's Brislong repair history. Bariz's work alone uncovered stairways and passages later sealed again. Those choices still shape what's left today. In the end, the picture looks like this. The mainstream ties the Sphinx to Khafra in the 4th dynasty. West and Schoch argue that rainfall erosion and seismic data suggest an Ice Age origin. Manichev and Parkhomenko push the water story back 800,000 years. Andrew Collins suggests the stone is ancient, but the carving is younger. Conservation science points to salts and layered limestone as fast-acting damage within just a few thousand years. And all of it sits on top of centuries of reburials, clearances, and repairs. The Sphinx isn't just a statue.
I think you can argue that the Sphinx is the most recognizable statue anywhere in the world.
It's a layered record of human ambition, natural forces, and mystery. And now, with a chamber under its paws, that mystery only gets deeper. Of course, once you start talking about hidden chambers, you can't ignore the bigger legends, the myths of doorways, shafts, and whole worlds beneath the Sphinx, myths of the Sphinx's underworld. When people talk about the strangest mysteries of ancient Egypt, the Sphinx always finds its way into the conversation. It's not just because it looks impressive with that massive lion body and human head, but because stories keep popping up about what might be hidden under it. You've probably heard the rumors: secret doors, tunnels running under the plateau, maybe even connections straight to the pyramids. A lot of this buzz goes back to the early 1800s. The year 1837 comes up a lot, usually in a twisted way. People online will say French explorers found a hidden doorway under the Sphinx and covered it up, or that some mysterious colonel named Weiss saw it and kept quiet. Here's what actually happened. In 1837, it wasn't a French team, and there wasn't a doorway. It was a British dig led by Colonel Richard William Howard Weiss and his engineer John Shea Perring. On Weiss's orders, Perring drilled straight down into the back of the Sphinx, right behind the head. That hole later became known as Perring's Hole.
Napoleon, standing in front of the Sphinx, buried still at this point, up to its shoulder.
The drill rods jammed about 27 feet deep, and when they tried blasting them loose, they ended up damaging the stone. When archaeologists cleared it again in 1978, they found a chunk of the Sphinx's headdress in the rubble. No tunnel, no grand passage, just the scar left from 19th century drilling. Now that doesn't mean there aren't passages anywhere near the Sphinx. Mark Lehner and Zahi Hawass, two of the most famous Egyptologists alive today, actually mapped one. It's a small, rough tunnel carved into the northwest side of the Sphinx's rump. But before you get too excited, here's the kicker. It doesn't go anywhere.
How the pyramid was built, you will know that inside the pyramids there is many hollows and many gaps.
Hawass confirmed this back in 1997 during a Nova interview. So what about those flashy headlines from the past few years saying secret tunnels discovered under Giza in 2019? That's another mix-up. Those discoveries weren't under the Sphinx at all. They were inside the Great Pyramid of Khufu. In 2017, the Scan Pyramids team used muon imaging, basically cosmic particles that can reveal voids in stone.
A team of international scientists made the apparent find using cosmic ray imaging.
And they announced a large empty space inside Khufu's pyramid. In 2023, they revealed a short corridor about 30 feet long hidden above the main entrance. And in 2024, another group said they had found a shallow anomaly in the sand north of the pyramid. These are real discoveries, but they're all inside or near Khufu's pyramid, not the Sphinx. The headlines made it sound like an underground subway system was found linking everything together. But in reality, it was just voids inside the pyramid itself. Now, if we move a little across the plateau, there actually is a dramatic underground structure that fuels the underground Egypt hype. It's called the Osiris Shaft. You enter through a vertical shaft cut into the bedrock right under Khafra's causeway. Go down, and you hit a series of levels with side chambers and finally a lower room that floods right at the water table. Zahi Hawass published the full details of it. It's definitely impressive and multi-level, but it's not connected to the Sphinx. It's under Khafra's causeway, part of a different story entirely. And then there are the Giza caves. Author Andrew Collins has written about cracks and cavities near what's called the Tomb of the Birds, north of the plateau. He suggested there could be a larger cave system beneath the area.
Because of the size of his tomb, because of the unique shape of the vaulted ceiling, and also because it was cased inside with plaster.
In 2009, Hawass responded directly. He admitted, yes, there are shallow cavities, but no, they're not some massive underground city or a secret world tied to the Sphinx. In fact, the site was sealed for conservation and left at that. Collins kept the cave theory alive in books, but official archaeology says it's just shallow cracks, not a hidden underworld. So let's add this up. When it comes to the Sphinx itself, here's what we actually have. There's the short, rough shaft at the northwest rump, clearly hacked out by looters long after the statue was built. And there are the modern conservation trenches and drains mapped during the Sphinx mapping project. That's it. No hidden hallways, no grand tunnels, nothing that looks like it was carved by the original builders. So, where does the idea of a secret door or library under the Sphinx even come from? A lot of it ties back to a man named Edgar Cayce in the 20th century. He was a so-called psychic who claimed, while in trance, that survivors of Atlantis buried their records in a hall of records under the Sphinx. That story captured people's imaginations, and even though there was no evidence, it kept the idea alive for decades. Books, documentaries, and TV specials ran with it. Even today, you'll still hear people say the Hall of Records is just waiting to be opened.
It's as though everywhere we open up a hole in the desert, we find massive evidence of bread baking.
But it's not in any excavation notes, surveys, or site reports. It's pure myth. Fast forward to the 21st century, and you'll notice the same cycle keeps happening. In 2019, and again in 2025, big claims popped up about tunnels or even an underground city under Giza. Archaeologists and fact-checkers had to step in and point out that what people were sharing were just radar anomalies or voids detected by imaging, not mapped tunnels or hidden streets. Basically, the science gets cautious, the headlines blow up the language, and the myth grows. And one last detail people often misread. The body of the Sphinx itself has gone through so many repairs that sometimes what looks like a secret wall is just a restoration layer. Helps separate those repair skins from the original stone. That's the charm of the Sphinx, though, isn't it? Even after being studied for over 2 centuries, drilled into, mapped, scanned with radar and muons and patched up by countless restorers, it still fuels wild stories. But the underground isn't the only place where mysteries hide. The Sphinx's face tells its own story, the secrets written on its face. Let's move right up to the face of the Sphinx, because this is where the myths pile up faster than the sand that buried it for centuries. The very first question everybody asks is about the nose. In classrooms all over the world, you'll still hear the story that Napoleon's soldiers blew it off.
What has Napoleon got to do with Egypt and the Sphinx? Well, in fact, Napoleon led an invasion of Egypt in 1798.
With a cannon when they came to Egypt in the year 1798. Sounds dramatic, but it's not true. We have sketches from long before Napoleon ever set foot in Egypt that show the nose already missing. The most famous is by the Danish traveler Frederick Louis Norden, who drew the Sphinx in 1737 with the nose gone. On top of that, when you look closely at the stone itself, you can see the marks where long rods or chisels were hammered in under the nostril and along the bridge to pry the nose off. That's not a cannon shot, and it's definitely not erosion. It's someone deliberately hacking the face. So who would do that? The oldest written story comes from the 15th century historian al-Makrizi. He wrote that a Sufi named Muhammad Sa'im al-Dahr mutilated the statue in 1378. The reason, according to the story, is that he saw locals making offerings to the Sphinx as if it were a sacred figure, and he thought that was idolatry, so he struck the face to stop it. That's not courtroom proof, but it fits the chisel evidence on the stone, and it's the earliest record that actually names a person. That's why most modern historians think it's the best explanation we have. Now, fast forward to today, and the internet finds new ways to stir the pot. In 2022, pictures started going viral online of what people called the sleeping Sphinx. In the photos, the eyes looked closed, like the statue had suddenly shut them after thousands of years. The images exploded across social media. But within days, Egypt's Ministry of Antiquities and multiple news outlets confirmed the truth. The pictures were either altered or taken from weird angles. Fact-checkers labeled them fake, and regular tourists who were there that same weekend flooded social media with their own photos. And in every single one of those, the Sphinx looks the same as it always has, eyes wide open. The beard is another big talking point. Unlike the nose, parts of the beard still survive. A massive fragment of it is in London today, sitting in the British Museum. It's catalogued as EA58 and is dated stylistically to the New Kingdom, which is many centuries after the Sphinx was first carved in the Old Kingdom. That's important because it suggests the beard wasn't original. It was probably added later, either as decoration or as a restoration piece. Early 19th century diggers, especially Giovanni Battista Caviglia, found more pieces of the beard buried in the sand between the Sphinx paws. Cairo holds some of those fragments today.
The beard was thought to have been part of repair work by Thutmose IV. The other parts of the beard are now inside Cairo Museum.
There were even talks in the 1980s about reattaching it, but most conservators now agree that putting a heavy stone beard back on would just stress the already repaired chin. So yes, the beard is real. But no, it's not proof that Khafra's original sculptors left the statue bearded. The best evidence says it was a later addition. Another thing people love to point out is the proportions. If you stand back, the head really does look small for the body. And that sparks endless theories about whether the head we see now is actually a recarved head. Some say it was originally Anubis with a jackal's head, later changed into a human face. Even Mark Lehner, who has spent decades crawling over the Sphinx, admits the proportions are odd. On most Sphinx statues, the lion's body is about 3 head lengths long. The Giza Sphinx's body stretches closer to 5. But instead of seeing it as a sign of recarving, Lehner points to a giant natural fissure that runs right through the bedrock near the statue's midsection. He thinks the ancient builders had to elongate the body forward just to finish the rump and tail safely. That stretched body makes the head look smaller than normal. It's not some big hidden story, just practical stonework. Could the face still have been recut in ancient times? Sure, it's possible. Some tool marks on the head are surprisingly sharp, which could mean later recarving. Even some critics of Ice Age dating admit recutting might have happened. But possible is not the same as proven, and the physical and cultural evidence points more to the head always being a king. The headdress fragments, the cobra emblem, the painted traces, and the later Egyptian name for the Sphinx, Horameket, meaning Horus in the horizon, all point to royal and solar symbolism. None of that lines up with Anubis. Another myth you hear is that maybe the nose was washed away by water. Erosion. That sounds neat until you think about the evidence. Water erosion rounds and softens rock. It doesn't leave 2 clean rod holes at precise spots on the bridge of the nose. Those holes are the giveaway that chisels did the work. Then there's the claim about how long the Sphinx was buried. Some people say it must have been a deliberate cover-up, like ancient Egyptians intentionally buried it to hide something. The real story is less dramatic. For centuries at a time, the desert winds just piled sand around the body. Sometimes the head poked out, sometimes even that was covered. Early explorers in the modern era only saw the head sticking out of the dunes, which is why so many 19th century clearance projects failed. The sand kept flowing back faster than it could be shoveled away. Only in the 20th century did large-scale efforts finally dig it out completely and keep it clear. So the burial wasn't some conspiracy. It was just the desert doing what deserts do. Since we're talking about the face up close, there are details most people don't realize. Conservators have found faint traces of pigment on the Sphinx. The face once had red paint across it, and there are remnants of blue and yellow elsewhere. This statue wasn't always the pale, sandy color we see now. It was once brightly painted, a living monument that glowed in the sun. Add that to the cobra emblem and the beard fragments, and it's clear the Sphinx was designed to look like a powerful king, not a jackal god. Myths will always fill the gaps, but the stone itself gives us enough clues to push back against the wildest stories. Thanks for watching. See you in our next video.